My name is John Dodson. I'm an urban farmer in Richmond, Virginia, and I'm for the soil because without healthy soil, there's no healthy food. With no healthy food, there's no healthy life.
And a belated Happy New Year, everyone. I'm Jeff Ishee, your host of For the Soil, a Conversation. We want to thank you for tuning into this episode as we kick off a brand new year in 2024. This is actually the third year of our podcast, and we want to thank you for your support. By the way, if you need to listen to a previous episode, you can do that at the website forthesoil.org, and at the menu bar right there on the top, just click on podcast and you'll have a lot to choose from. Let's get to this episode. Welcome again to For the Soil, a Conversation. I'm Jeff Ishee, and joining us in just a moment, our co-host, Dr. Eric Bendfeldt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Dr. Bendfeldt, would you do the honors of introducing our returning guest this week?
Yes, Jeff, we're pleased again to have Dr. Stuart Grandy with us from the University of New Hampshire. And Dr. Grandy specializes in natural resources and the environment, and specifically with soil science. So thank you again for being here. And Dr. Grandy, you had mentioned about how you were inspired by your interactions with farmers, and if you could speak to just the importance of the power of observation when we think about soil health systems.
Sure, and it's great to be here once again. One of the observations that I've heard from many growers is that they are not applying the recommended rates of nitrogen, for example, but they're also maintaining or even building soil organic matter. And this was an observation that I heard many, many times from many different growers of different types, growers producing different kinds of crops and working at different scales and in different countries. I repeatedly heard this observation, and that led me to want to understand what might be underlying those dynamics. And we haven't fully solved that yet. But again, it was an observation that I'd heard so many times from so many different farmers in different places around the world that I began to wonder if they might be managing their nutrient cycles and their carbon cycles in ways that's enabling more efficient use of nutrients and also accumulation of soil organic matter.
I'm so glad you used that phrase, the power of observation. It immediately reminded me of a time in my childhood when my father and I used to love to garden in our backyard. And I remember specifically, there was one day that he had a brand new tool. It was a cultivator, maybe a new hoe, some kind of new gadget in the garden. And I said, Dad, what is the most important tool for you in the garden? And he thought for a moment, and he turned around and he pointed at the lawn chair. Yeah, the lawn chair. And he said, Jeff, the power of observation is critical to successful gardening. You need to just sit back, sit down, and observe what's going on in your garden, and you'll learn more about everything concerning your garden. And I wanted to ask you from that perspective, what is, and we'll stick with the topic of backyard gardening, what is the most important thing that a novice gardener should know about soil health and the power of observation?
Jeff, I'll circle around to that, but I want to also mention that as a scientist, observation is also very important. And many graduate students start out working in one area and observe something during an experiment that raises questions. It's something that was completely unexpected that they would have never noticed if they were not being careful and observant of the systems in which they were working. And this opens up opportunities to make new discoveries in areas that were not originally planned. But Mary, did you have a question?
No. Well, I'd be interested in Jeff's and, what that means for your backyard gardeners versus, say, your large row crop producers.
I think backyard gardeners are facing some of the same issues that larger producers face with regards to water and nutrients and pest cycles. And they have opportunities to engineer the systems in a way sometimes that larger producers cannot. They can make raised beds. They can recycle some of the crop residues in a compost pile and reapply those to the soil. But the basic challenges are quite similar. How do we deliver water during those periods of drought? How do we make sure that there's adequate nutrient supplies in the spring without over applying fertilizers? How do we ensure that there's adequate quality of the physical structure of the soil to enable root growth?
As a follow up to that question, you've mentioned about sort of nutrient cycling, specifically nitrogen, and it seems like now carbon cycling is more prominent because of its importance to the availability of nitrogen and phosphorus and other elements. What are you learning as far as nitrogen and carbon cycling and how they're work together?
They cycle together, and it is almost impossible to think about one without thinking about the other. And when we talk about building soil organic matter, that is an approach to building both carbon and nitrogen in the soil. So the field of soil science has worked very hard over the last 2 decades, 3 decades to develop fractionation techniques to break down that massive pool of organic matter into separate, distinct pools that vary in their function. Some may provide more nitrogen. Some may be longer lived and persistent, and those are the ones that we're quite concerned with for mitigating atmospheric increases in carbon dioxide. And so what these fractionation techniques allow us to do is to think about how can I manage my soil for multiple functions, for providing nitrogen, providing phosphorus and other nutrients, for building habitat for microbes, and also sequestering carbon and contributing to drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide.
We're talking today with Dr. Stuart Grandy. He is with the University of New Hampshire Natural Resources and the Environment. And Dr. Grandy, one question or one topic I'd like to get to is drought. 2023 was a year of severe drought in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And one thing I learned, in grade school is that water is essential to life. And of course, there is life in the soil. So my question is, describe how life in the soil is impacted by an extended period of drought.
In general, you're going to see a reduction in the activity of life in the soil. When we think about building soil health, one of the outcomes that we're very interested in is developing resilience to drought. And ideally, we would see connections between increases in soil health and water storage capacity, and the capacity for roots and their associated fungi to branch out and encompass a broader area in the soil and thereby access water from locations that they otherwise might not be able to. We've seen in our own research that there are pools of nutrients in soils that are associated with the accumulation of organic matter that appear to be able to supply nutrients under drought that inorganic fertilizers are not able to do. And so we do see some resilience of the delivery of nutrients under dry conditions due to organic matter accumulation that we don't see simply with the addition of inorganic fertilizers. So, Jeff, coming back to your question, one of the things that we're thinking about in terms of building a resilient soil is to increase the soil health, build those organic matter pools that are capable of continuing to supply nutrients under dry conditions.
And Dr. Grandy, how do you, when you're working with farmers or for those ag professionals working with producers, how do you suggest they translate this science into on-the-ground application?
Great question, Mary. I think that this starts with an open mind. And when I work with growers, I go into those interactions with an open mind, and they very often do too. And I think when we go into it with an open mind and a willingness to learn from each other, anything is possible. I am going to be able to observe things working with soil all day long that they don't have the time and the instrumentation to be able to do. At the same time, they're observing firsthand these interactions between plants and soils and microbes that matter for productivity. So for me, the first thing I think about is we may come from very different backgrounds. We may have all kinds of differences in how we think about things and see things, but we share this common desire to know more about soils and crops and to be able to produce crops in a way that's sustainable and economical. And so let's join together in a way with an open mind to learn from each other. Now, to specifically answer your question, I don't share information with growers intending it to be prescriptive, because every farmer has a different operation. They grow different things. Their soils are different. Their history is different. Their influences are different. Where they're getting information is different. But if I can share with them information that helps them see things differently, that gives them ideas about how they might be able to better manage their system, then in my mind, that is a benefit of the work that I'm doing. And by the same, flipping that around, they aren't going to give me information about how to set up an experiment in my lab, but they can certainly provide loads of information about how to think about these kinds of interactions that we're both interested in that can lead to my developing experiments.
And thank you, Dr. Grandy. In thinking about that, the importance of soil health as place-based, local context, and also based on people's values. And if you would have a recommendation as far as helping farmers to further observe what's happening, what would you recommend as far as maybe an on-farm research process?
I think if they're interested in on-farm research, then they have loads of resources at their fingertips. They can reach out to you, Eric. They can reach out to Mary. They can reach out to scientists at Virginia Tech and across the Southeastern District that are interested in doing on-farm research, and many, many farmers are.
Are there any particular resources that you recommend, Dr. Grandy? Books or YouTube videos? There's a ton of, literally millions of YouTube videos, and a lot of them are on the topic of soil health. But concerning resources, are there any that you would recommend?
I think that there is an abundance of really good science now available, and search engines that are widely available, like Google Scholar, provide access to what's emerging in the sciences. What inspires me are those discussions with growers and my amazing students and postdocs that come in with incredible ideas. When I was first becoming interested in soils, there was a scientist by the name of Matt Liebman, who was at Iowa State for many years, who really inspired me with his integration of an ecological perspective with an agronomic perspective. And I think that his work is as relevant today as it's ever been. Again, he was a chair of sustainable agriculture at Iowa State for many years, and I had a chance to overlap with him at the University of Maine. But today, I'm inspired by the work being done by students in my lab and students around the world and farmers themselves. There's such an incredible push in the field of soil science right now occurring globally that every time I have the chance to interact with early career people at a conference or going to visit a university like I did Virginia Tech recently, I come away amazed and inspired.
Can you repeat the name briefly of the individual in Iowa State?
It's Matt Liebman, Liebman.
I suspect a lot of people are Googling that name right now. If he was an influence in your life and career, I'm sure he would be an influence in many lives and many careers when it comes to soil health. But unfortunately, our time is up in this episode. Dr. Grandy, I want to thank you for joining us today and also in the previous episode. And thank you for what you do with regard to soil health here in our region. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And Dr. Bendfeldt and Mary, we'll catch you in the next one.
Yes, thank you so much.
For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org. If you have a specific question about soil health, call your local extension office, your local USDA service center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts. All rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishee.